You know, it's wild to think about, but in the summer of 2010, the Iranian government woke up to this just, well, catastrophic mathematical reality.
Absolutely, the math just didn't work anymore.
Right, because for years they had been operating under this very specific geopolitical assumption, basically that European nations were just way too dependent on Iranian crude oil to ever actually impose total suffocating energy sanctions.
Yeah, they thought they had an invisible shield.
Exactly. The logic was super simple. If the West cuts off Iranian oil, global energy markets spiral out of control, right? And Western economies would crash. So they felt protected. And then, I mean, almost overnight, that shield just evaporated.
Completely vanished.
Yeah. The U.S. and the European Union suddenly enacted these unprecedented unilateral embargoes that targeted the absolute jugular of the Iranian state. And the immediate result was a devastating recession, a total collapse of the national currency, and just runaway inflation.
And that timing, that specific economic shock in 2010, that is the vital starting point for the deep dive we are doing today.
Yes, exactly.
So we're unpacking a really comprehensive 2024 academic paper by Sina Emami. It's titled Beyond Sanctions: The Resistance Economy as the Islamic Republic of Iran's Policy Discourse for Economic Independence.
A bit of a mouthful, but yeah.
Right. But what Emami argues here is that this specific crisis, this sudden realization, it forced the Iranian establishment to realize that, well, improvising their economic policy just wasn't an option anymore. They had to fundamentally rewrite their national economic DNA.
Okay, but before we really dig into the mechanics of how a state actually attempts to rewrite its economic DNA, we need to address the elephant in the room, the inherent friction of studying this topic.
Yeah, it's a heavy one.
We are stepping into an arena that is dominated by deep historical grievances, highly charged international politics, and, active economic warfare. So for you listening, to understand the source material, to actually map the internal logic of this doctrine, we have to strip away the normative lenses we usually apply to global economics.
Which is easier said than done.
Absolutely. So our objective today is strictly analytical and entirely impartial. We are not taking sides. We are absolutely not endorsing the worldview of the Iranian establishment, nor are we validating the positions of its international adversaries.
We're just looking at the blueprints.
Right. We are simply taking Emami's research and dissecting the framework of what Iran calls the resistance economy, or اقتصاد مقاومتی, just to understand how they perceive their own survival from the inside out.
And keeping that analytical distance is crucial because, well, Western economic models usually view international trade through this lens of mutual benefit, right? Like absolute advantage. We trade, we both get richer.
A win-win situation.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But the Iranian policy discourse views the global economic system as an active theater of combat. They operate under this concept called Nizam-e-Solte, which roughly translates to the order of domination.
The order of domination.
Yeah. So in their worldview, the international financial system isn't some neutral marketplace. It's a rigid hierarchy, basically designed to punish any state that tries to challenge the dominant powers.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because to understand how they plan to survive this order of domination, we really have to move past the typical metaphors people use.
Like what?
Well, people usually compare a sanctioned economy to a massive ship trying to navigate without a GPS. Like someone turns off the satellite and the ship is blind.
Right, I've heard that one.
But losing GPS just means you might get lost, right? It doesn't actually stop your engine from running. A much more accurate analogy for what the resistance economy is actually trying to achieve, I think, involves human biology.
Oh, I like where this is going.
Think of a national economy functioning like a vital organ, and it relies entirely on a centralized cardiovascular system, which in this case is the global US dollar financial network to pump blood into it.
Okay, yeah.
If the central heart decides to cut off circulation, that organ suffers necrosis. It dies. So the resistance economy is basically the attempt to rapidly evolve an independent, localized circulatory system that can actually survive amputation from the host body.
Wow. And that biological desperation, it didn't just materialize out of thin air in 2010.
Right, there's history here.
Huge history. To understand the psychological drive behind growing that localized circulatory system, Emami's paper takes us way back to the mid-20th century.
Oh, the Mossadegh era.
Exactly. The Iranian establishment's absolute fear of economic strangulation is deeply rooted in the 1951 to 1953 era under Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh.
Right, Mossadegh is the architect of nationalizing the Anglo-Iranian oil company.
Yes, which was a massive deal.
Right, because up until 1951, the British essentially controlled the extraction and, crucially, the profits of all Iranian oil, and Mossadegh's administration just decided, nope, we are reclaiming that asset.
And the British retaliation wasn't just, an angry letter or diplomatic protest.
No, it was brutal.
It was a masterclass in economic siege.
Yeah.
They didn't just stop buying the oil themselves.
Right.
They leveraged their naval dominance and their absolute control over international maritime insurance to prevent literally anyone else from buying it either.
Which is just wild to think about. You have all this oil, but you can't put it on a boat because no one will insure the boat.
Exactly. And the data Emami provides highlights just how devastating that embargo was. In 1950, right prior to nationalization, Iran's oil revenues stood at 58.9 million US dollars.
Okay, 58.9 million.
Right. And following the embargo, across the subsequent years of Mossadegh's tenure, total revenues collapsed to a mere $8.4 million.
Wait, 8.4 from almost 59.
Yes, an absolute freefall.
I mean, a drop of that magnitude, that means the state literally can no longer pay civil servants. They can't build infrastructure. They can't even maintain a military. You are looking at the instant insolvency of an entire nation.
Exactly. So Mossadegh, trying to survive this, attempted to pivot. He tried to design what he called an oil-free economy. And the mechanics of this pivot are super important because they heavily shadow the later policies we're going to talk about.
Right, history repeating itself. So what did he actually do?
Well, to replace that lost oil revenue, he attempted to aggressively raise domestic taxes. He tried issuing government bonds to the public. And when all those measures fell short, his administration basically resorted to expanding the money supply.
Oh no, so they just turned on the printers.
Pretty much. They essentially printed fiat currency to cover the government deficits.
Which, I mean, anyone who studies economics knows that invariably triggers a localized inflationary spiral.
Every single time.
Yeah, printing money to replace lost foreign capital without a corresponding increase in actual domestic production just devalues whatever currency is sitting in citizens' pockets. It destroys their purchasing power.
Precisely. The attempt to restructure the economy on the fly like that failed catastrophically.
Yep.
It generated rampant inflation, which led to widespread domestic unrest.
Right, people couldn't afford bread.
And that unrest ultimately created the fertile domestic ground required for the 1953 Anglo-American coup that ousted Mossadegh.
Which brings us back to the psychological trauma of it all.
Exactly. If we connect this to the bigger picture, for the Iranian establishment that took power over 2 decades later, during the 1979 Islamic Revolution, the autopsy of that Mossadegh era provided a foundational doctrine.
Which was?
That reliance on a single commodity, especially one exported through a Western-controlled supply chain, is an absolute existential vulnerability.
Okay, but that brings up a massive historical contradiction that I always struggle to reconcile.
What's that?
Well, if the architects of the 1979 Islamic Revolution internalized the lesson that oil dependency was a fatal flaw, like, if they literally had the Mossadegh autopsy report sitting on their desks, why didn't they immediately dismantle that structure the moment they took power?
That is the million-dollar question.
Right. I mean, they had the absolute momentum of a popular revolution. It seems like the perfect window to fundamentally restructure the state's revenue model, yet they spent the next 30 years running the exact same oil export playbook.
That contradiction is brilliantly explained in the paper through this concept called discursive ambiguity.
Discursive ambiguity. Okay. Translate that into the actual mechanics of state building for us.
Okay, so think about it this way. When you look at, say, the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917 or the Chinese Communist Revolution of 1949, those revolutionaries possessed a highly granular, ideologically rigid economic blueprint.
Right. They read Marx. They knew what they wanted.
Exactly. Their entire revolutionary justification was economic. Historical materialism, abolishing private property, collectivization of agriculture. When they seized power, they immediately executed that blueprint because the economy was the core of their ideology.
The Soviet state knew exactly what to do with the factories and the farms on day one.
But the 1979 Islamic Revolution was fundamentally different. Its hegemonic discourse, the prevailing narrative that united all these various factions to overthrow the Shah, was centered on cultural identity.
Right, not economics.
Right. It was about cultural identity, political independence from foreign powers, and Islamic jurisprudence. It lacked a cohesive economic manifesto.
So no grand plan for the banks.
None. Beyond these really broad populist calls for social justice and independence, there was no unified theory on how to actually manage the national bank or structure taxation or handle international trade.
So they successfully overthrew the entire political structure, but they inherited the exact same economic machinery, and they didn't have a clear manual on how to rebuild it.
Exactly, which led to severe policy whiplash throughout the 1980s and 1990s.
Tell me about the whiplash.
Well, during the Iran-Iraq War from 1980 to 1988, the sheer exigencies of a brutal existential conflict forced the state into massive centralization.
They had to take over to survive.
Yeah. The government nationalized industries, they strictly controlled foreign exchange, and heavily subsidized basic goods just to keep the war effort going and the population alive.
Right.
But then, after the war ended, and particularly during the presidency of Akbar Hashemi Rafsanjani in the 1990s, the pendulum swung violently in the opposite direction.
Toward market liberalization, I'm assuming.
Yes. Taking cues from the post-Cold War era and institutions like the IMF, Rafsanjani pushed hard for privatization, the creation of free trade zones, and reintegration into the global market.
So they're bouncing back and forth between state control and free markets.
Exactly. And the paper notes that this ideological yo-yoing meant that while Iran fortified its military and its political independence, its economy remained a highly fragile, traditional rentier state.
Okay, the mechanics of a rentier state are crucial here. We really need to define that clearly for the listener.
Go for it.
A rentier state doesn't generate wealth by taxing the productive labor or the manufacturing output of its citizens. Like, they don't make their money off people building cars or designing software.
Right.
It generates wealth by renting out indigenous natural resources, in this case, drilling oil to foreign buyers. The state just gets massive checks from abroad, and then it distributes that money downward to the population through subsidies and bloated public sector jobs.
It's an artificial economy, in a way.
Yeah, it creates this dynamic where the government doesn't actually need a productive domestic economy to fund itself. It just needs the oil to keep flowing.
And that model works incredibly smoothly, right up until the foreign buyers decide to stop writing the checks.
Which brings us back to the early 2000s and the lead up to the 2010 crisis. The geopolitical landscape shifts radically.
Yeah, huge shifts.
In 2003, the U.S. invasion of Iraq inadvertently eliminates Iran's primary regional rival, Saddam Hussein. It transforms Iraq from a hostile neighbor into a state where Tehran suddenly wields massive political influence.
All right, their whole neighborhood changed.
Combined with the successes of allied groups like Hezbollah in Lebanon, Iran begins to project significant regional power. They are feeling confident.
They are actively advancing a revisionist foreign policy. They're openly challenging the U.S.-led status quo in the Middle East.
And the West doesn't just sit back and watch.
No, they respond.
Apa.
And they respond by targeting Iran's nuclear program, utilizing the United Nations Security Council to pass a series of resolutions between 2006 and 2010.
Right, resolutions 1737, 1747, 1803, 1929.
Exactly. These impose multilateral sanctions, but importantly, initially, they were targeted.
Targeted how?
They focus heavily on arms embargoes, dual-use technologies, and specific individuals, like freezing bank accounts of generals. They did not attempt to decouple Iran from the global energy market.
Right, because, as we mentioned at the start of the deep dive, European dependence on Iranian crude acted as a massive deterrent.
Wow.
The West literally couldn't afford to sanction the oil.
They needed it too badly.
But that calculus is entirely upended by a technological breakthrough that had absolutely nothing to do with Middle Eastern politics, the U.S. shale revolution.
Oh, this is the pivot. What's fascinating here is how geology basically rewrote diplomacy.
Seriously. The advancement of hydraulic fracturing and horizontal drilling, basically fracking, allowed the United States to unlock massive domestic reserves of oil and natural gas.
And the macroeconomic impact of this just cannot be overstated.
By flooding the global market with millions of new barrels of domestic supply, the U.S. fundamentally altered the global supply curve.
Right.
Suddenly, Iranian oil transitioned from being this critical, irreplaceable asset in the global energy mix to being highly fungible, entirely dispensable.
It's like a massive corporation suddenly finding a new local supplier for a critical part.
Exactly, a perfect analogy. Suddenly, the overseas supplier they used to tolerate just because they had to can be cut off completely. The U.S. and Europe realized they could sanction Iranian exports down to zero, and the new American shale production would prevent a global price spike.
The shield was just gone. And in the summer of 2010, the U.S. and the European Union capitalized on this new reality. They enacted sweeping, unilateral embargoes on Iranian oil and gas, alongside severe restrictions on the Iranian central bank.
And the domestic timing in Iran couldn't have been worse. These sanctions hit during the administration of President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad.
Yeah, the paper has some strong words about that era.
Imami's paper characterizes it as an era of severe economic mismanagement, right?
Yes, the Ahmadinejad government had pursued highly populist, expansionary fiscal policies.
What does that look like on the ground?
Essentially, spending heavily on cash handouts and increasing liquidity without corresponding economic growth.
Oh, so printing money again.
Sort of, yeah. And when you combine internal fiscal recklessness with an external blockade of your primary revenue source, the economic machinery just seizes up entirely.
This is the exact moment the highest echelons of the Iranian establishment realized the era of discursive ambiguity has to end.
They had no choice.
They could no longer afford the ideological yo-yoing of the past 3 decades. The biological amputation we discussed earlier was happening in real time, and they desperately needed a survival doctrine.
The timeline here is really fascinating because you can actually see the doctrine being formulated in direct response to the embargoes almost month by month.
Walk us through that timeline.
Okay, so on July 5th, 2010, Ayatollah Khamenei issues a communique focused on reforming consumption patterns.
Reforming consumption, interesting.
Yeah, and this document isn't just about balancing a budget. It targets the cultural psychology of the nation. He demands a promotion of frugality, a deliberate move away from luxury and wastefulness,
A tightening of the belt.
and, crucially, a systemic rejection of foreign goods.
Wow. And then what?
2 months later, on September 7th, 2010, he addresses a gathering of Iranian entrepreneurs. And this is the moment. This is when the term resistance economy is officially injected into the state's lexicon.
He's talking to business owners.
Right. He frames the act of running a business, creating jobs, and manufacturing goods not merely as capitalist enterprise, but as a defensive weapon.
So making shoes is now a patriotic defense strategy.
Exactly.
Hmm.
He tells the private sector that their patriotic duty is to circumvent the sanctions and render the economic war ineffective.
You know, the strategy of how this doctrine is actually forced into the public consciousness is pretty brilliant from a bureaucratic standpoint.
Oh, the calendar thing.
Yes, the paper details what we can call the calendar strategy. Because in Iran, the supreme leader designates a specific name or theme for each Persian calendar year, right?
Yes, and it signals the state's absolute priority to all branches of government and the public.
So if you look at the sequence starting from that 2010 crisis,
Right.
It is a relentless, unbroken drumbeat.
It really is.
The year 2011 is designated the year of economic jihad. 2012 becomes domestic production and support for Iranian capital. 2016 is resistance economy, action and implementation.
Fast forward to 2023, and it's controlling inflation production growth.
Right. For over a decade, the highest authority in the country dedicates nearly every single year to macroeconomics.
By utilizing this discursive power, he effectively ends the ambiguity. The economy is no longer secondary to cultural or foreign policy goals. It is elevated to the primary battlefield of national survival.
Okay, but I want to challenge the premise of this entire rhetoric for a second.
Okay, go ahead.
When a government under international siege starts issuing communiques about reforming consumption, promoting frugality, and declaring economic jihad, the historical precedent usually points to one thing: wartime rationing.
Right, like World War II.
Exactly. It sounds like an authoritarian state preparing its populace for extreme austerity, basically telling them to accept poverty, tighten their belts, and retreat into isolation. The paper pushes back against this interpretation, but the optics look identical to a bunker mentality.
I get why you'd say that. And the optics definitely suggest a bunker. But the underlying mechanics detailed in the paper suggest something different. It's more like a fortress designed for outward projection.
Outward projection? How so?
Well, when the moderate administration of Hassan Rouhani took office in 2013, Ayatollah Khamenei explicitly clarified that the resistance economy is fundamentally incompatible with isolationist austerity.
So he flat out said this isn't just about hiding.
He argued that simply hunkering down and rationing dwindling resources is a slow death.
So if it's not rationing, what is the actual mechanism for surviving the sanctions? Because they still don't have the oil money.
The core mechanism is what the doctrine calls democratizing the economy.
Okay, wait. Democratizing the economy is a really loaded term.
Very much so.
In a Western context, democratization of the economy usually implies, like, labor unions, wealth redistribution, or massive antitrust enforcement.
Right, breaking up monopolies. But in the context of the resistant economy, democratizing strictly refers to moving away from the state-dominated rentier model.
How? By selling off state assets.
Yes, through aggressive privatization and the massive expansion of the non-oil private sector.
Ah, okay. I see the tactical logic there.
What do you see?
Well, if a state relies on a single, monolithic, national Iranian oil company for 80% of its foreign currency, the U.S. Treasury only has to target the bank accounts of that one specific entity to bring the whole country to its knees.
Exactly. It's a massive, centralized, single point of failure.
But by decentralizing wealth generation, by encouraging tens of thousands of private, knowledge-based companies, agricultural exporters, and mid-level manufacturers, you distribute the economic nodes across the entire society.
It is infinitely harder for a foreign power to monitor and sanction 50,000 independent, medium-sized private enterprises exporting goods across regional borders.
Right, compared to tracking massive oil tankers leaving a single state-run port. Decentralization basically becomes a camouflage mechanism.
That's a great way to put it. But that brings us to the operational reality. Speeches about decentralization and annual slogans, that's just rhetoric.
Great, talk is cheap.
To fundamentally rewire a state's economy, you need codified law. And that codification happened on February 18, 2014, with the official issuance of the General Policy of Resistance Economy.
This is the blueprint.
This is the 24-point blueprint that served as a binding mandate for all executive, legislative, and judicial branches. Every single ministry had to align its 5-year development plans with these 24 points.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting. Because analyzing these 24 points is where we actually see the mechanics for that independent circulatory system we talked about earlier.
Yeah, let's break it down.
We can synthesize this sprawling legal document into 3 major operational themes to make it digestible. Let's start with theme 1, which encompasses points 1 through 5, and critically, point 10.
Okay.
This theme is entirely focused on strategic production and export dominance.
And point 10 is the clearest rebuttal to the idea that this is an isolationist policy. It legally mandates comprehensive support for expanding exports and explicitly calls for the creation of new foreign markets.
Right. The state's objective is to become the leading exporter of goods and services in the region. Let me stop you there, though, because the mechanics of that are super confusing, if not completely contradictory.
How so?
You have a nation actively locked out of the global banking system, completely isolated from major shipping insurers, and heavily sanctioned. How does a state in that position realistically plan to become a regional export hegemon?
It sounds impossible.
It assumes a level of frictionless international trade that they simply do not have access to. How do they sell stuff if they can't use banks?
Well, they don't have access to frictionless Western-aligned trade. That is why Theme 1 relies heavily on Theme 2, which covers points 13 through 15, financial resilience and energy independence.
Okay.
And this is where we have to discuss the mechanics of the SWIFT banking system and the absolute necessity of alternative clearing methods.
Right. SWIFT. For those who don't know, SWIFT is the Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication. It is basically the nervous system of global finance.
Yeah, almost every major bank uses it.
When a business in Japan buys goods from a business in Brazil, they don't physically fly pallets of cash across the ocean, right?
Now, that would be ridiculous.
The banks use SWIFT to send secure messages to clear the transactions, almost always settling the trade in U.S. dollars. And because the transactions rely on dollar clearing mechanisms, they ultimately route through U.S. financial jurisdiction.
Which means the U.S. government can observe and, if they want to, block them.
Right. So being cut out of SWIFT is the financial equivalent of being excommunicated. You just can't do business.
Which is exactly why the resistance economy mandates the creation of mechanisms that bypass SWIFT entirely. The 24-point plan explicitly directs the state to engage in strategic, asymmetric interdependence with neighboring non-Western nations.
So skipping the dollar.
Right. The blueprint calls for the aggressive use of bilateral currency swap agreements and sophisticated barter systems.
Okay, we need to explain how a multi-billion-dollar barter trade actually works for a modern nation-state, because it's not just two farmers trading a cow for a tractor.
No, it's a bit more complex than that. At a state level, it involves setting up localized clearing accounts.
Give me an example.
Let's say Iran exports crude oil to India. Instead of India paying in US dollars via SWIFT, the Indian government deposits Indian rupees into an account held at an Indian bank, but under the name of the Iranian central bank.
Okay, so Iran has a bunch of rupees sitting in India, but Iran cannot easily convert those rupees to dollars or move them globally, right?
Exactly. They are trapped rupees. However, Iranian importers can use that stockpile of rupees to buy Indian agricultural products, machinery, or pharmaceuticals.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, effectively executing a massive closed-loop barter of oil for goods without a single US dollar changing hands and without a single message crossing the SWIFT network.
I mean, it's an incredibly high-friction way to conduct international trade. It's inefficient, and it limits your purchasing options strictly to whatever the partner country produces, but it achieves the primary goal.
It is entirely sanction-proof.
It bypasses the order of domination completely.
And that leads into how they handle the energy sector within Theme 2. The blueprint acknowledges they cannot instantly stop drilling oil, but they can alter how it is sold.
Point 15, right?
Yes, point 15 mandates a massive shift away from exporting raw crude oil, because crude is highly visible, easily tracked by satellite, and requires massive, sanctionable tankers.
Hard to hide a supertanker.
Very. So instead, the mandate is to heavily invest in domestic refineries to process that crude into petrochemical products, plastics, fertilizers, industrial chemicals.
The economic logic there is airtight. Petrochemicals have a vastly higher profit margin than unrefined crude. But more importantly, from a sanctions evasion perspective, finished petrochemicals can be shipped in much smaller, less conspicuous containers. They can be loaded onto regular trucks and driven across porous land borders into Iraq, Turkey, or Afghanistan.
It completely decentralizes the export physical footprint, making it incredibly difficult for Western enforcement agencies to blockade.
It's brilliant, honestly. And it also mandates structural fiscal reform. Point 17 requires the government to disconnect its operational budget from volatile oil revenues and shift toward funding the state through domestic taxation.
Which is huge. This is the official death knell of the rent-to-your-state model.
Right, because if the state must rely on taxing its citizens' businesses to survive, it has a vested interest in ensuring those businesses are actually profitable and globally competitive. They can't just ignore the domestic economy anymore.
Which segues perfectly into Theme 3, covering points 19 through 21, transparency, anti-corruption, and jihadi culture.
Wait, jihadi culture applied to anti-corruption.
Yeah, this is where Emami's paper highlights the merging of economic pragmatism with revolutionary ideology.
Break that down.
Well, in many developing nations, anti-corruption campaigns are framed as matters of civil rights or good governance, right? Like, don't take bribes, it's bad for democracy.
Sure.
But the resistance economy frames economic transparency as a vital component of national security.
Because if a state's economy is opaque, monopolized by cronies, and plagued by embezzlement, it is inherently fragile.
Exactly. And a fragile economy provides leverage to foreign adversaries.
Right. Foreign intelligence can blackmail corrupt officials.
Exactly. So the doctrine elevates the fight against domestic corruption to the level of a holy struggle, a jihadi effort. It argues that you cannot fortify the perimeter against economic war if the internal foundations are rotting from graft.
So the architecture of the 24 points really is comprehensive. It addresses the macro-level energy shift, the micro-level privatization, the international banking workarounds, and the internal legal transparency.
It covers all the bases.
But having a blueprint doesn't guarantee the building gets constructed according to plan.
Oh, definitely not.
Because a nation-state is not a monolith. You have intense factional rivalries, massive bureaucratic inertia, and deeply entrenched economic interests that do not want to lose their monopolies.
Right, the elites don't want to give up their power.
So how did this top-down mandate actually land in the vicious arena of Iranian domestic politics?
The paper dedicates significant analysis to the discursive battles that erupted around the interpretation of the resistance economy, particularly after the moderate administration of President Hassan Rouhani came to power in 2013.
Right, the Rouhani years.
So Rouhani's government publicly accepted the 24-point blueprint, but they immediately began interpreting it through a lens that justified their own political agenda.
Which was the JCPOA, the nuclear deal, right?
Exactly. The moderates viewed the economic crisis as a diplomatic problem that required a diplomatic solution.
While the hardliners viewed it as an existential war that required a structural fortress.
Yes. You see this play out clearly in the rhetoric of Rouhani's cabinet. Vice President Eshaq Jahangiri frequently framed the resistance economy as a mandate to aggressively increase oil exports and rapidly regain the global market share they had lost to sanctions.
Wait, which completely contradicts the spirit of Point 15, which demands moving away from crude oil dependency.
Yep,
Jahangir was essentially saying, we resist by selling more of the very commodity that makes us vulnerable.
a very creative interpretation. And meanwhile, Mohammad Nahavandian, Rouhani's vice president for economic affairs, he framed the doctrine as a temporary shield.
Temporary.
Yeah. He argued that the resistance economy was necessary to stabilize the country and build leverage so that Iran could enter diplomatic negotiations from a position of strength, ultimately aiming to lift the sanctions and reintegrate into the global economy.
So the Rouhani faction is treating the 24 points like a tourniquet. You apply the tourniquet to stop the bleeding while you negotiate with the paramedics to fix the wound.
Great analogy. But Ayatollah Khamenei and the original architects of the doctrine view it entirely differently.
How so?
For Khamenei, the sanctions are not a temporary misunderstanding over a nuclear program. They are the permanent, structural reality of dealing with the order of domination.
It's not a bug, it's a feature.
Exactly. The resistance economy is not a tourniquet to wait out negotiations. It is a permanent genetic mutation of the state. He views reintegration into a U.S.-dominated financial system as a return to vulnerable dependency. The goal is to build an economy so resilient that the lifting of sanctions becomes completely irrelevant.
Wow. The paper also contextualizes this doctrine by comparing it to other historical and regional economic models, which I found fascinating. Because Iran isn't the first developing nation to try and protect its economy from Western dominance.
No, not at all.
If you look at Latin America in the mid-20th century, they heavily utilized import substitution industrialization, or ISI.
Right. ISI was a dominant economic theory aiming to reduce foreign dependency through local production of industrialized products.
The mechanics of ISI relied heavily on erecting massive tariff walls. Like, a country would ban or heavily tax the import of foreign cars, for example, to force the creation of a domestic auto industry. And the state would heavily subsidize these new domestic factories.
Right, trying to build everything at home.
But the historical flaw of ISI was that without the pressure of international competition, those domestic monopolies became incredibly bloated, technologically stagnant, and just wildly inefficient. The citizens ended up paying exorbitant prices for terrible products.
Exactly. And Western analysts often dismiss the resistance economy as just a rebranded, doomed version of ISI.
Is it?
The paper argues that comparison completely misreads the 24-point blueprint. ISI was fundamentally protectionist and inward-looking. The resistance economy, while prioritizing domestic production, explicitly mandates global competitiveness and export-driven growth.
But they don't just want a captive domestic audience.
No, it doesn't want to build a mediocre domestic car industry just to substitute imports. It wants to build knowledge-based and petrochemical industries that can successfully conquer the regional markets in Iraq, Central Asia, and the Caucasus. It is an outward-facing strategy utilizing asymmetric trade routes.
Okay, let's compare it to a contemporary model then. Look at what is happening across the Persian Gulf right now. Saudi Arabia has Vision 2030. The United Arab Emirates has spent decades diversifying Dubai away from oil.
Right, the Gulf model.
Both are petrostates, recognizing the vulnerability of relying entirely on hydrocarbons. Isn't Iran's blueprint just a sanctioned version of what the Gulf states are doing?
The structural desire to move away from oil is similar, yes. But the ultimate objectives, the teleology of the policies, basically are diametrically opposed.
In what way?
Saudi Arabia and the UAE are diversifying to prepare their economies for a post-carbon future while aggressively intertwining themselves with Western capital, Western technology, and the global financial order.
Right, they're buying sports teams and building tech hubs.
They are diversifying to secure their status at the top tier of the current international system.
They want to be the premium VIP members of the Order of Domination Club.
Exactly. But Iran's diversification is entirely defensive. They are diversifying to ensure the survival of a political system that is actively dedicated to resisting and dismantling that very same international order.
Ah. The Gulf diversifies to thrive within the system. Iran diversifies to survive outside of it.
Beautifully put. And this philosophical distinction is crystallized in a really important document the paper examines from 2019.
What's the document?
Ayatollah Khamenei issued a declaration titled The Second Phase of the Revolution, marking the 40th anniversary of the Islamic Republic. And this document serves as a major course correction from the discursive ambiguity of the 1979 era we talked about earlier.
Oh, interesting. So 40 years later, they're officially updating the software.
Yes. In the 1980s, the economy was an afterthought. But in the 2019 declaration, he places it center stage. However, he is incredibly specific about its function.
What does he say?
He explicitly states that the economy is not the ideal of the Islamic society. It is not the ultimate end goal.
So making money isn't the point.
Right. The goal remains cultural, religious, and geopolitical independence. However, he defines a strong economy as the critical means without which those ideals cannot be protected.
So if we look at the macro perspective, the Iranian establishment views their geopolitical and ideological project as the architecture of a grand fortress.
Okay, yeah.
A strong economy isn't the fortress itself, it's the foundational concrete. If the concrete is weak, porous, and prone to crumbling when external pressure is applied, it doesn't matter how grand the architecture is, the entire structure collapses.
Exactly. And the 2019 declaration actually acknowledges the internal corruption, the structural defects of the rentier state, and the managerial incompetence of the past 40 years.
Bro, they admit it.
Yes, stating unequivocally that implementing the 24-point resistance economy is the only way to pour a foundation capable of surviving the siege.
It is a sobering assessment that strips away the populist rhetoric of the early revolution and replaces it with just cold structural pragmatism. They finally recognize that political independence is an illusion if a foreign treasury department can turn off your central bank with a keystroke.
Which brings us back to the core premise of Emami's research. The resistance economy is not a temporary band-aid. It is not a series of emergency rationing measures to weather a difficult diplomatic winter.
It is a decades-long paradigm shift. It is the attempt to cure an economic vulnerability that has haunted the state since the Mossadegh era in 1951. It is the realization that in modern warfare, the supply chain is the front line and currency is the artillery.
And, the meticulous dissection of this doctrine leaves us with a macroeconomic reality that extends far beyond the borders of Iran.
It really does.
The source material highlights that the Iranian framework explicitly challenges the excessive interdependence of the Western-led capitalist economy. And considering the broader geopolitical landscape today, that presents a fascinating, almost unsettling blueprint for the future of global trade.
Unsettling is the right word.
Because the implications are profound. If you zoom out from Iran and look at the broader global context, the United States and the European Union are increasingly utilizing maximalist economic sanctions as their primary weapon of coercion.
Right. We see entire sectors of the Russian economy severed from SWIFT. We see escalating technological and trade embargoes directed at China.
The central heart is increasingly deciding to cut off circulation to various organs.
And as those organs are cut off, they are all being forced to study the mechanics of survival. We are watching Iran attempt to operationalize a 24-point blueprint designed explicitly to build a localized, sanction-proof circulatory system.
They are clearing trades in local currencies, relying on massive barter frameworks, and pivoting entirely toward Asian and regional markets.
Which raises a really provocative thought for you, the listener, to mull over.
Are we witnessing the prototype for an entirely parallel global economy?
Seriously. If the order of domination relies on the monopoly of the US dollar and Western financial infrastructure to enforce compliance, what happens when half a dozen heavily sanctioned, resource-rich nations successfully map their own localized systems?
It changes everything.
If they all adopt their own native versions of a resistance economy, how long will it be before those isolated, decentralized networks begin linking together? A barter agreement between Iran and India today could be the precursor to a massive, formalized, non-dollar trading bloc tomorrow.
The attempt to sever these nations from the global economy might actually be forcing them to build a secondary global economy entirely immune to Western leverage.
That is a staggering macroeconomic shift to contemplate.
It suggests that the ultimate legacy of the 2010 sanctions, but the permanent fracturing of the unified global financial system.
A completely new map of global trade drawn not by mutual benefit, but by the mechanics of resistance. That is an incredible framework to leave our listeners with today. The deep mechanics of international sanctions, historical trauma, and the attempt to rewrite a nation's economic DNA, it's all there in the blueprint. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the resistance economy. Until next time, keep questioning the map.